Mandy Hickson, what a story yours is. Only the second woman to fly a Tornado fighter jet, a GR-4, in combat. So many missions, 50 missions, I think, over Iraq. An amazing story. And yet you don't come from a service family as such, do you?
No, I don't actually, Fred. So my immediate family, my mum was a teacher, my dad ran his own carpet business, and the only connection I really have was my grandpa, who was a pilot in the Second World War. So I did grow up hearing stories from him, which was just fantastic.
Now, you joined the RAF in 1994, and you say in your lovely book, An Officer Not a Gentleman, you say, blame Tom Selleck, the star of Magnum on the television. He was your first crush. But how did he lead you into this flying career?
Well, it was quite funny, actually. So I have to say, this was the days before iPlayers or videos and everything. And Tom Selleck used to be on television in Magnum on a Tuesday evening. And we were sitting at home, Mum and I on the settee, and I was watching Tom Selleck having my weekly fix. And she was reading the local newspaper, and she pointed out that the Air Training Corps, now known as the RAF Cadets, was opening its doors to girls for the very first time the following Tuesday. And she said, why don't you join? And I sort of looked at her and I said, well, what night's it on? And she said, Tuesdays. And I went, oh no, Tom Selleck's on television. At which point she said, but they do canoeing. And I thought, And then she said, but you go to an all-girls school and it might be your only chance to meet some boys. And I thought, good point. And I joined on that premise, basically.
And enjoyed it from day one?
I absolutely loved it, yeah. It was a very different sort of organisation, and it's been really lovely, actually, having written this book, and it's connected with a lot of youngsters. I've been now connected to so many young people that have said, you've made me realise it's okay to be a bit different, that actually I might be joining it because I do enjoy sort of sports and team and crawling around in mud on night exercises, and that's okay. Absolutely it's okay, because that was exactly the sort of person I was. You know, I loved all the STEM subjects at school as well. And when I joined the Air Cadets, I flew as well on an air experience flight. And it was literally that moment when I thought, oh my goodness, if I can find a career where I can do this, then I will be made for life.
But joining the RAF wasn't straightforward, was it? You got turned down a couple of times, didn't you?
Yeah, so, I mean, when I chose this as a career, women weren't allowed to be pilots on the front line. So it was a bit of a non-starter initially. But I continued to pursue that dream. And at 17, I was awarded a flying scholarship. I gained a private pilot's license. And then when I was at university in my second year in Birmingham, they changed the rules allowing women to join. I applied and I failed all the computer-based tests. I didn't fail them once, but twice, and you're only allowed to take them twice. And this is where I really say that sometimes we really need pivotal people in our lives that can change our own direction. And mine was in the form of a boss on that university club, and he couldn't understand why, when I proved myself to be a capable pilot in the air, I couldn't pass some computer-based tests. And so he went the extra mile for me. He escalated this through the ranks, and he started to challenge the RAF and said, maybe your tests are not designed for women. They've only been tested on men. Why is it so many women fail them? And in the end, after offering me a commission to become an air traffic controller, which I took as a stepping stone because I felt that once I was in, I could make my case. But it felt like a really big step to say I'm happy to sign up for a huge career in a career that I'm not going to want to stay in, which was the air traffic control world. And it was only once I was in the Air Force, after writing a lot of letters, that I managed to persuade them to take me on as apparently a test case. They wanted to see how far I'd get through the system, potentially without failing.
And how big a jump was it from that to actually flying these monsters?
Well, it's incredible. The RAF training is phenomenal, Fred. I mean, you are taken as stepping stones, 4 different courses to take you up to flying a Tornado. And each stage of flying training, you double the speed of the aircraft that you're flying. So each one feels very much within your own capability because they're building up your capacity at each level. And I think the big turning point is when you fly this aircraft that's behind me, the amazing Hawk, which was the trainer, advanced flying training. And this one goes at a similar speed to the Tornado, but is in a much more basic level within the actual aircraft. So there was no head-up display, no GPS, no moving map, whereas the Tornado GR4 has all of those things. And so actually your capacity is pushed to its absolute limit in advanced flying training. And that's the make or break where people really can determine, have they got what it takes to make it to the front line?
It was difficult for you though, wasn't it? Because you were, if you like, a woman at that time in what some considered to be a man's world. And you were the victim of occasional bouts of sexism.
Yeah, and I think what we have to remember is the Royal Air Force 27 years ago was a very, very different place to the one it is now. And thank goodness it is. And yes, there was sexism. I mean, to walk into rooms and there'd be pornography on all the walls. For every single instructor on some of the courses would make just one very flippant sexist comment a day, not meant in a vindictive manner, I would say. And it really wasn't. It was just thoughtless. It was just because there weren't any other women. And so we were both cutting our teeth on this new era whereby women were coming through. And I was always surrounded initially with a course of guys. And those courses would vary as slightly as you're going through training with different people. But generally it was the same people. So these are my brothers in arms. These are my best friends. The time when I struggled the most, I would say, was when I finally got to fly the Tornado and I arrived on my frontline squadron and they'd never had a female pilot on the squadron. And that was difficult. You know, I perhaps overcompensated. I tried to perhaps fit in by becoming a bit more blokey, swearing more, drinking more. And it's only actually after you've settled in a little bit where you realise it's not about fitting in, it's about finding belonging. And that's a very different thing. And finding acceptance as well.
Fascinating. Take us inside the cockpit of one of these machines that you're flying. I mean, it's cramped. It's kind of scary.
It is. I mean, it's a very tight environment. Bizarrely, the Tornado's a lot more spacious, actually. You have armrests and everything. But the Hawk is a much, much tighter cockpit. And when you join the Royal Air Force, you are measured. Basically, your full ergonomics are all measured. Can you reach switches? Is your femur too long? And my femur was within millimetres of being too long because I'm 6 foot tall. So, you know, that's tall, but it's not really huge, you know, if I was a man, for example. But in the back seat of a Hawk, there's a switch just above your right knee. And if you press it, it's called the press to test. It's the emergency, sets off all the emergency warnings, and it's a way of testing, do all your emergency systems work and all the bulbs go off. And if I was ever flying in the back seat of a Hawk and someone in the front seat just rolled inverted very quickly without me expecting it, my knee would come up and it would hit this switch and all the alarms would go, woo, 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 woo. And the person in the front would go, oh my gosh, sorry, it's just my knee. But I did slightly have a concern. I used to think, gosh, if I were to eject from a Hawk, would I kneecap myself as I went out? I think I'd really want to be tucked back in my seat. But no, they are very tight.
And uncomfortable?
No, not that uncomfortable, actually. The ejection seats that you sit on, you know, all the strapping, you know, it holds you in place. I mean, I have had back issues ever since, but let's hope it wasn't from that.
Claustrophobic?
Yeah, it's not the best environment to be if you were claustrophobic, I can imagine. I mean, the most claustrophobic I've ever probably felt, though, was in the Tornado, actually, in Iraq, because as we were taxiing out, you'd have to have the canopy down, and all of the air conditioning systems at the time would be directed towards all of your avionics to keep them all, you know, cool on the ground. So there's no air flowing over you, and on one occasion, it was, I think, 46 degrees in temperature, and you've got the top down, and you're sitting in a greenhouse and you are getting hotter and hotter and you have got all of this kit on. You know, you're not just sitting in like I am now, you have thermal underwear, flying suit, combat survival waistcoat, life support jacket, you have a gun in your pocket, gold bullion, radios, all of this kit, and you are just melting in the heat. And that did get a little bit, I just need some air, you know.
What's it like when you're at the controls?
It's unbelievable. I think the first time I ever took off in a Tornado, literally the smile was plastered on my face. And I remember writing my book, is this just a fast jet thing? Am I going to be permanently smiling for life? Because you push these throttles, the twin throttles fully forward, and the burner's light. And you've done it in the simulator by now many, many times, and you're thinking, yes, I've practiced this, I know how it all works. Click one burner, click the second burner. But when you do it on the actual runway and then these burners light and you feel this thrust of the engines, it is phenomenal. You're literally thrust back into your seat and you get about 2G of lateral acceleration as you career down this runway ready for takeoff. And that is a phenomenal moment.
And as you're taking off on one of these combat missions, does it ever cross your mind, this could be the last time?
No. I don't think you ever need to think like that at all, actually, and I don't believe any of my colleagues ever thought like that. Again, that's just not the way that your mind works. You're just going off to do a job. People often say, oh, is it not really scary, is it not? But actually, I would put it into a comparative of basically you've trained to play football all your life, and you finally get the opportunity to play for your Premier League team, and then you're sitting on the bench throughout. You know, you want to play. You've trained for this job, you want to do the job that you have trained for, which is ultimately going off into a war zone. And that's what you've trained for. So you're not fearful, your adrenaline is flowing and you're excited to some degree because that's what everything has been working towards for 5 years of training.
So many combat missions over Iraq, they called you the Desert Queen. And on one of your very first missions, there you were flying over Iraq, totally relaxed, all was going incredibly well. In fact, you were thinking of home. And then something happened, didn't it?
It certainly did, yes. So it was one of my final missions of that tour of duty over Iraq. And in the build-up to that night, the arterial routes between Baghdad in the north and Al-Basra in the southeast corner had always been fairly busy. But along the Saudi Arabia border, in 4 months, nothing had ever happened. And therefore, probably one of the biggest threats you have is complacency. And as you say, sweeping up my last target, it was a reconnaissance mission. I was taking photos and my mind was wandering about the fact I was going home, going to see my fiancé, and suddenly we were locked on by a surface-to-air missile. My navigator saw it in his night vision goggles and he just shouted, "Mandy, brake right." And I immediately responded. I sort of slammed my throttles fully forward and we rolled to 120 degrees. We pulled hard towards the ground. We put out our flares and they act as a decoy to a surface-to-air missile that had locked onto the heat of my engines in this heat-seeking mode. As the flares left and we chilled our engines, the missile picked up the flares and it exploded about 2 miles away from our jet. I'll be honest, at that point, there were a few expletives that were muttered and it became a little bit chaotic on the radios as well, because once we radioed through what had happened, the complexity of the mission then went through the roof, because the way it worked out there is that once an aggressive act is made towards any one of the coalition aircraft, you're entitled to prosecute an attack on a target. We were given a target as a response option, but we were running out of fuel. I was leading my first ever combat mission that night, and I felt there was a huge pressure on me. I was the only woman on my squadron. It was my first leadership mission. I've just been shot at by a missile, and there was this need to perform. You know, after consultation with the team, we decided to try to get some more fuel from an air-to-air tanker, a mobile petrol station, let's say, which was out in the skies of Saudi Arabia. The complexity of this mission just spiraled, really. And, you know, basically, I'd never been on a flight like this. But what was a really fascinating turn on this one is that my boss happened to be my number 2 in my formation. And he never stepped in. He never took control. He allowed me to continue to lead that mission, even though it must have been very tempting for him to step in and say, I have control, I'm taking over, but he doesn't, because that's not the way it works in the military. If you're the formation leader at the start, you will be the formation leader at the end. And I think business can learn an awful lot from that as well, because you often see when someone's given a task and then things get more complex, that someone will just leap in and say, I'm taking over, but you never get growth. And I learned more about myself that night, I think, than I have on any other. Through the complexities of that, accountability in my decision making and how to handle stress.
It must have been scary a lot of the time, or wasn't it? Were you oblivious to it?
It's not that you're oblivious to it. The one thing I was fearful of, and this is with all truth, is letting your team down, because you don't want to be seen as the weakest link. And you know, there's so many different aspects of the kit that you're flying with that are slightly different. We have secure radios over there, and you've got to put in a whole set of codes, for example. And that was a really stressful moment on the ground of inputting all of these codes into this radio, and you finally got a beep at the end to say, it's in. And then I would think, oh, thank goodness I can go secure. That was seems like a minor thing, but if you mess that up, you might not be allowed to go over the border and therefore actually perform the tasks. I think one of the scariest nights I had over there was when President Bush Jr. had just taken over presidency, and we were tasked to head up much further than the 33rd parallel, that was basically the northernmost point of our zone that we were flying in, and we were given special powers to go over that border that night. And basically the mission involved many hundreds of aeroplanes, and we were tasked to take out a fibre optics building. And as we were proceeding north, the Iraqis realised that there was obviously something happening. And my navigator said, Mandy, are your night vision goggles, which sit on the top of our helmets, and they give you, great vision at night. He said, are your goggles up or down? I said, they're up. And he said, leave them that way. Well, like a toddler, I immediately put them down to see what he was talking about. And I popped them down, and it was like bonfire night. There are missiles, tracer rounds, flak all in front of us, right on the corridor that we're travelling up. And I thought, so I thought, actually, I'll put the goggles back up because, quite frankly, I don't need to see it. And actually, we carried on, and I was working in a four-ship of aircraft. And I was doing a cooperative attack on a site, and I was providing the laser guidance for the weapon that was going to be dropped by my colleague, by my wingman. And afterwards, when we landed, we saw the footage because there had been a Predator, an unmanned aerial vehicle above us that was filming all of the footage. And this, when you ask, what's it like, this made it real. We watched in black and white on this infrared footage of a gentleman who was obviously working at this centre. He was standing outside. He had a coffee in his hand because it was glowing white with the heat. He was having a cigarette. He put his cigarette down, finished his coffee, threw it on the floor. You see this really hot white patch. He opens the door and goes inside the building as our weapon enters the other side of the building. And I'll be honest, at this point, my heart was in my mouth, and I'm watching this footage, and there was quite a lot of banter, and I'm thinking, this is the reality of what you're doing. And at this point, the door reopens, the man comes out, he runs across the car park, he gets into a car, and he drives straight across through the fencing out into the desert. And he obviously survived. And the door frame was the bit that was existing still, and he was literally must have just been on the other side of the door. And I thought, oh, thank goodness he got away, because it does personalise it, but you're not doing this job flippantly. We would never, if there was any risk of civilian casualties, we would never, ever drop our weapons. And that was the way that we did. So it was very, very tight rules of engagement out there.
I was going to say, you are in charge of this lethal machine, and you have got civilians down there, but you've got a job to do. Do the civilians cross your mind?
Yeah, all the time, absolutely, and rightly they should. And that's why I was always so proud to serve in the Royal Air Force, because, as I say, rules of engagement were incredibly tight, and if there was any risk of any civilian damage or collateral damage, we would say, then basically we would not drop our weapons. On one occasion, we were on a target run to destroy a huge gun. It was called an SA-60. And as we were going down the run, my navigator said, stop. I had 3 seconds to weapons release. And he said, stop, stop, stop. All the switches are made safe. We pulled off the target. And I said, what was going on? He goes, there's a man with a camel. And he just happened to be nomadically wandering very close to where our weapon was about to go in. And so we wouldn't drop. And that sat well with me, that if there was any risk of damage, then we would not ever prosecute our mission.
Such a wonderful career, but eventually you found yourself having to make a choice, a career or a family.
Yeah.
How did you find yourself in that situation?
It's very difficult, and I always knew I wanted to have children, and so I was coming to the end of a tour, and I got pregnant. I didn't know I was pregnant, actually, to be honest, Fred, and I carried on flying, and very sadly I miscarried, because you're being hit in the stomach constantly by a G-suit. And it hit a natural point where I thought, I do want to still have a family. Now that I know I can proceed down that route, actually, I was about to go into a ground tour. And so I said, I'm going to carry on with the ground tour. And I had a very productive ground tour, because it basically meant I had 2 children in that tour. But the difficulty there was at the end of that that period, I was working at command headquarters at High Wycombe. I basically had a really difficult career choice, which was, do I go back to the front line or as an instructor at RAF Valley and Anglesey, or a ground tour? And if I carried on either of these two routes, it meant that I would have career progression. But if I chose the ground tour at Boscombe Down, near Salisbury, there was a job that had to be a Tornado pilot that did it. And I'd looked into this and thought, oh my goodness, this could work for a career. And I'd contacted my posting officer who's in charge of your career. And I said, what about this? And he said, Mandy, if you do that, you will never progress in your career because that's not a good enough job for career progression. But I thought, gosh, if I don't take that job, I can't be a mum. I can't just leave my children and go out to Afghanistan, which is where the Tornado was deploying to at the time. And so I had to make a brutal decision, career or children and family life. And I chose at that point to continue a job in the Royal Air Force, but without the potential of career progression.
Any regrets?
No regrets at all. I think regret is a futile emotion, and I just, well, the only regret I have is not buying a beach hut at Muddyford. But there we go, you can have a few, can't you? But no regrets on that, because ultimately I was enabled to be mum, to have a wonderful house and home in Winchester, to settle, and it set me up therefore for my next stage of my career for when I left.
So tell us about that. What are you up to now?
So when I left 10 years ago, I looked around what all my colleagues were doing, and all of them were becoming airline pilots. And I thought, well, that's what I should do, because I was in sheep mentality. And I think when you don't know what to do, it's easy to follow the crowd. However, it was after a little bit of a chat and through a fortuitous conversation with someone at a dinner party when I was telling the story about Iraq, where someone suggested I go into motivational speaking. And I said, what is that? I've never even heard of it. And they said, well, you can speak at conferences. And I was like, really? Talk about myself? It's like, fantastic. So anyway, I looked into this world and the doors opened up. And basically I started to get people booking me for events. I spoke at a lot of schools. I mean, I loved it. I contacted all the schools in Hampshire and Dorset, and I would say the majority of the Dorset private schools all came back and got me in to speak to the children, which was fantastic. And at the time I was flying as an air experience pilot as well as a volunteer at Boscombe Down, and taking young cadets up as a lovely way to close that circle for myself, but also to encourage youngsters, because I'm a real believer that you cannot be what you cannot see. And I did not want young girls as cadets turning up to Boscombe Down and seeing all male pilots. And I wanted there to be some really strong female role models. And so I was flying doing that as well. And I flew a young girl on one occasion, which was just turned into the most wonderful story. And it's in fact how I closed my book out. Her name was Emily, and she turned into the most natural aviator I've ever met in half an hour. You can see someone's got that raw skill. You know, and I said to her, is this something you want to do? And she sort of went, I never thought I could do it. I was so scared I was going to fail, I decided not to try and show you I was interested. But this is all I've ever wanted to do. And we had this light bulb moment, I think, between the two of us, where she realised that she could do it, that she now had purpose. She could try at school because she had a goal. And I realised that I didn't have to just follow the crowd and become an airline pilot. I could utilise all the skills and everything I'd learnt in aviation and act as a role model to the future generations and get that story out there to as many people as possible. And so, yeah, the keynote speaking business just, excuse the pun, took off like nothing else. And over the last 10 years, I've probably visited, well, tens of, coming up to hundreds of different countries all over the globe, and speaking to audiences from the age of 4 through to octogenarians and wonderful people of the WI, but, you know, huge blue chip corporations as well. And it's been fantastic.
You've also climbed Kilimanjaro.
Yeah, I squeezed that one in. I did Kilimanjaro in 2019 with a group of 20 women, all from different walks of life, many from Hampshire. A lot of us were raising money. I was raising money for Winchester Hospice, which basically is nearly opening its doors. And many of the others were raising money for the Murray Parish Trust, which was for the Southampton General Hospital Children's Ward. And we raised hundreds of thousands between us, between the 20 of us. It turned into one of the most challenging, fulfilling, incredible experiences of my life. And the women I met on that have turned into my greatest friends.
Here we are at the Boscombe Down Aviation Collection at Old Sarum Airfield, surrounded by all these wonderful aircraft. How does that make you feel? Is it good to be here?
There's a smell.
Yes.
It's an amazing smell, and as soon as you walk into a hangar with aircraft in it, the smell is the same, and you are immediately transported back to your time in the Air Force. And there's a sort of spine-tingling feel to it, you know, especially when I saw this Hawk behind me. I've actually flown it. It's in my logbook. It was at the Empire Test Pilot School at Boscombe Down for many years, and it's an incredible aircraft. But looking around and the history here, you know, the stories that these aircraft could tell if they had a voice would just be amazing.
Any favourite planes?
It would have to be the Tornado GR. I mean, it's basically the big brother. I mean, the Hawk is fantastic. It always reminds me of flying of like a sports car, you know, that's your little nippy sports car, and then you get into the Tornado, it's like, here's the Formula One, big boy. And it looks like it is designed to, you know, it does what it says. It's a mean, supersonic, war-going machine that is a phenomenal aeroplane to fly. And I feel privileged and honoured to have been able to serve my time in the Air Force in the Tornado GR4.
Yours is a fantastic story, and you tell it so eloquently. What would your advice be to any young lady watching now who thinks, I'd like to be like her? What would you say? I
would say believe in yourself. You know, so often we talk ourselves out of doing things because we're fearful that we might fail at something or we're scared. What I would say is, if I was to give you a superpower, it would be getting rid of that fear of failure, not being scared of what the outcome might be, but to try these new opportunities and believe that you can achieve them. And my mum always said to me, you know, if it's going to be someone, why shouldn't it be you? So set yourself up for success, not for worrying about the outcome if you don't.
Mandy Hickson, the book is called An Officer, Not a Gentleman. I would suggest it ought to have been called An Officer and a Lady. An absolute joy to meet you, and all the very best in the future.
Thanks so much, Fred. It's been a genuine pleasure to meet you too. Thank you.